The Galactic Senate chamber stretched wide like the inside of a giant shell, and thousands of alien representatives sat in their assigned seats, talking and arguing about matters that shaped the fate of countless worlds, while humanity's single ambassador sat quietly in the outer ring where newcomers always sat. Watching and waiting and learning, Ambassador Elena Vasquez had spent 12 years in this chamber, and she had grown used to being ignored, had grown used to the way the elder races looked past her as if she were furniture, had grown used to the polite smiles that never reached their eyes. And she had learned to use that invisibility like a weapon. The Dominion of Ethel controlled the center of the chamber, their tall and graceful representatives dressed in robes that shimmered like liquid starlight. And they spoke with voices that carried the weight of 8,000 years of galactic dominance, never raising their tone because they never needed to. Beside them sat the sovereignty of Keth, insectoid beings with compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not imagine, their clicking mandibles translating into smooth diplomatic speech through devices older than human civilization. And they watched everything with the patience of creatures who measured time in generations rather than years. And then there was the hegemony of Vaor, massive reptilian warriors who had conquered half the galaxy before the Ethel convinced them that trade was more profitable than war. Their scaled hides decorated with honor marks that told stories of battles fought when humanity was still learning to make fire. These three powers had ruled the galactic concord for 12,000 years, and they had seen species rise and fall like waves against a shore, had seen empires bloom and wither, had seen threats emerge and fade, and they believed they had seen everything the universe could offer. They were wrong. Humanity had joined the Concord 63 years ago, arriving with smiles and open hands and eager questions, presenting themselves as humble newcomers who only wanted to learn and trade and find their place among the stars. And the elder races had accepted them with the same condescending patience. They showed all young species Earth's colonies, numbered 14 small worlds on the outer rim, and their fleet consisted of patrol frigates and cargo haulers that the elder races considered barely functional. And their technology was generations behind the great powers, and they posed no threat to anyone. This was the story humanity told, and the elder races believed it because it fit their expectations. Because young species were always weak and eager and desperate for approval. Because the pattern had repeated so many times across so many millennia that no one thought to question it. But deep in the darkness between stars, far from the sensors and patrols of the Concord, something massive was taking shape. Project Prometheus had begun 3 days after first contact, when humanity's leaders gathered in bunkers beneath Geneva and watched recordings of Ethel warships that could crack moons with a single volley. And they made a decision that would shape their species. Forever they would smile and bow and play the role of the grateful newcomer. And they would build something terrible in secret. The construction site floated in the Oort cloud, hidden among billions of icy rocks that no one ever bothered to scan. And for 60 years, the finest minds humanity had ever produced worked in absolute silence, solving problems that should have taken centuries. Driven by a fear that burned hotter than any star, resources disappeared into black budgets that even most human leaders never saw. And asteroid belts were quietly hollowed out by mining ships that officially did not exist. And factories on distant moons produced components that were shipped through routes no Concord database had ever recorded. Elena Vasquez knew about the project because her grandfather had been one of its founders, and her mother had spent her life managing its logistics. And now Elena carried the burden of knowing what was coming while pretending to be nothing more than a mired diplomat. From a minor species she sat in her seat and listened to the Ethel representative speak about trade disputes that did not matter. And she nodded politely when the Keth delegate made a joke at humanity's expense. And she showed nothing on her face when the VAR ambassador suggested that humans should be grateful for the scraps they were given, but in her mind, she could see it clearly. The thing that was waiting in the dark, the 3 kilometers of adaptive armor and quantum-locked weapons and fury given physical form. The ship they called the Indomitable Will. The elder races believed they understood power, believed they had mastered the art of war and peace and everything between, believed that their ancient wisdom made them superior to all who came after. They did not understand humanity. They did not understand what it meant to evolve on a world that tried to kill you every single day, to survive ice ages and plagues and predators and your own worst impulses, to claw your way from caves to cities to stars through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. They did not understand that humanity had learned one lesson above all others, written in blood across 10,000 years of history, burned into their collective soul by wars and famines and disasters that should have ended them 100 times. Over the universe does not protect. The weak Elena watched the Senate debate, and she smiled her polite smile, and she waited, because the time was almost here, because the signals from the Orc cloud had confirmed that the Indomitable Will was complete, because humanity was finally ready to show the galaxy what they truly were. Not grateful newcomers desperate for approval, not harmless traders content with scraps, but survivors, forged in fire and blood and darkness, carrying weapons they had built in secret because they knew that someday they would need them. The elder races had ruled for 12,000 years, and they thought they knew everything. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The emergency signal came at midnight Concordia time, screening through every channel and dragging representatives from their rest chambers with the urgency that only true disaster could create. And within an hour, the Senate chamber was full of confused and frightened beings who demanded to know what had happened. High Chancellor Varmath stood at the central podium, his massive reptilian form wrapped in ceremonial robes that suddenly seemed too thin, and his voice carried across the chamber with a tremor that no one had ever heard from a VR leader before 3 Vrethkai colony worlds had gone dark. He announced, and the chamber erupted into chaos. The Vrethkai were an insectoid species allied with the Keth, peaceful traders who had never harmed anyone, and their 3 border colonies had housed 6 billion souls who were now simply gone. Their cities silent, their ships drifting without power, their distress signals cut off mid-transmission. Keth delegation rose as one, their compound eyes blazing with fury, their mandibles clicking so fast that the translators struggled to keep up. And they demanded to know who had committed this atrocity, who had dared to strike at Concord members without warning or declaration. The Ethel representative suggested that perhaps the Vyre had returned to their old ways. And the Vyre ambassador roared with such fury that security drones activated throughout the chamber. And accusations flew like weapons while the truth remained hidden in the darkness between. Stars Elena Vasquez sat in her seat and said nothing, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully blank. And she watched the chaos unfold while her heart pounded against her ribs, because she knew what was coming next. The signal from the Indomitable Will had arrived 6 hours ago, a simple coded message that meant the ship was en route. And Elena had spent the time since then preparing herself for this moment, for the instant when everything would change. The chamber was still arguing when the sensors screamed. Every holographic display in the Senate flickered and then showed the same image. A ship dropping out of hyperspace directly above Concordia Prime. And the room fell silent with such sudden completeness that the absence of sound felt like a physical weight. The vessel hung against the stars like a predator, emerging from shadow. 3 kilometers of angular metal and gleaming weapon arrays. And it looked nothing like the elegant curves of Ethel design or the organic shapes of Keth vessels or the brutal simplicity of Var warships. It looked like something built by beings who expected to fight the universe itself and refused to lose high. Chancellor Varmeth stared at the display, his ancient eyes struggling to process what he was seeing, and his voice came out as barely a whisper that the chamber's systems amplified for all to hear. What species claims this vessel? He asked, and every representative turned to look at their neighbors, searching for some sign of recognition, some hint of ownership. Elena Vasquez stood, and for the first time in 63 years, every eye in the Galactic Senate turned to the human ambassador. The Terran Union claims the indomitable will, she said, and her voice carried across the frozen chamber with a clarity that cut through the shock like a blade. And we know who destroyed the Vrethkai colonies. And we have come to help. The silence stretched for 5 heartbeats. And then the chamber exploded. The Ethel demanded to know how humanity had built such a vessel, their graceful voices rising to pitches that Elena had never heard before. And the Keth clicked their mandibles in patterns that translated as fury and fear and disbelief. And the virus simply stared with eyes that held a new emotion that Elena recognized instantly. Respect, High Chancellor. Vermeth raised his massive arms and called for order. And slowly the chamber quieted, though the tension remained thick enough to taste. And he turned his gaze directly to Elena with an expression that mixed anger and curiosity in equal measure. You have violated 17 treaties and 4 sacred laws by bringing a warship to Concordia Prime, he said, and you have admitted to hiding your true capabilities from the Concord for 6 decades. And you expect us to believe you have come to help. Elena met his gaze without flinching, without showing any of the fear that churned in her stomach. And she spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire life. 6 billion Vrethkai are dead, she said, and while this chamber was busy throwing accusations, humanity was analyzing the energy signatures from the destroyed colonies. And we know what killed them because we have been watching the edges of known space for 60 years while you assumed we were too primitive to matter. She paused and let her words sink in, watching the expressions change across thousands of alien faces. The signatures match no known species in any Concord database, she continued, and they match patterns that our scientists found in ancient records. Records that speak of a threat so old that even the Ethel have forgotten it. A threat that ruled this region of space 100,000 years ago before it went silent. The chamber had grown very still, and Elena could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders as she spoke the words that would change everything. Something ancient is waking up, she said, and it is hungry, and it just announced its return by slaughtering 6 billion innocent beings. And you can stand here and argue about treaties while more worlds burn. Or you can accept that humanity built this ship because we knew this day would come. High Chancellor Varmeth leaned forward, his ancient eyes studying her with an intensity that few beings had ever survived. And how did humanity know? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Elena allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine expression she had shown in the Senate chamber since her assignment began, because we have always known that the universe is not kind, she said, and we have always known that survival belongs to those who prepare for the worst. And we have spent 60 years preparing, while you convinced yourselves that nothing could threaten your perfect order. The indomitable will hung above them, silent and waiting, and the Galactic Senate understood for the first time that they had never really known humanity at all. The hours that followed Elena's announcement were the most dangerous in humanity's short history among the stars, and she stood at the center of a storm that threatened to tear everything apart before the real enemy could even be faced. The Ethel Dominion demanded that humanity surrender the indomitable will for inspection, using diplomatic language that barely concealed their true intention, which was to seize the vessel and learn its secrets and ensure that no young species could ever threaten their dominance against the Keth sovereignty. Proposed immediate sanctions against all human worlds. cutting off trade and travel and communication until humanity agreed to submit to Concord authority. And their compound eyes gleamed with the cold calculation of beings who saw humanity as a problem to be contained, rather than an ally to be embraced. The VR hegemony was more direct. And their ambassador simply stood and declared that if humanity did not immediately withdraw the Dreadnought, the combined fleets of the hegemony would reduce Earth to a cinder and salt the ashes so that nothing would ever grow there. Again, Elena listened to each threat with her hands folded and her expression calm. And she waited for them to finish before she responded. "You are welcome to try," she said, and her voice carried no anger and no fear, only a certainty that made the elder races pause. "But I suggest you consider carefully before you act." She activated her personal display and projected data into the air above the central podium. Streams of information that showed energy signatures and weapon analysis and projections that made the military experts in the chamber lean forward with sudden interest. "The indomitable will carries weapon systems that you have never seen," she explained. "Technologies that humanity developed in secret, specifically because we knew that someday we might face enemies who had millennia of advantages over us. And while I cannot share the details, I can tell you that your flagship fleets would not survive the engagement." The VR ambassador snarled with contempt, dismissing her claims as the bluster of a desperate species. But Elena noticed that the Ethel military attach had gone very pale, and the Keth were clicking to each other in patterns that suggested rapid recalculation. "But none of that matters," Elena continued, "because while you debate whether to attack us, the real enemy is still out there, still hunting, still killing. And every hour we waste here is an hour they use to grow stronger." High Chancellor Vimeth raised a hand to silence the chamber, his ancient eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her skin prickle. And he spoke in a voice that demanded truth. "Tell us about this enemy," he commanded. "And tell us why we should believe humanity instead of assuming this is an elaborate deception to justify your violation of our laws." Elena had prepared for this question for years, had studied every scrap of evidence and rehearsed every argument. And she spoke with the confidence of someone who knew she was right, even if proving it might be impossible. The records were fragments buried in the oldest Ethel archives, she said, and our researchers found them during what appeared to be routine cultural exchange programs. And they spoke of a species that the early Ethel called the Silence because their victims never had time to scream. The chamber had grown very quiet, and Elena saw several Ethel representatives exchanging glances that suggested the name was not entirely unfamiliar to them. The Silence ruled this region of space before any current species achieved spaceflight, she continued, and they were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were harvesters, feeding on the life energy of entire worlds, stripping planets bare and moving on to the next target without mercy or negotiation. She paused and let the horror of her words settle over the assembly. "The records say they went dormant 100,000 years ago for reasons the early Ethel never understood. And humanity has spent 60 years watching for signs that they might return, building weapons that might hurt them, preparing for a war that we hoped would never come, and now they have returned," High Chancellor Vimeth said, and his voice had lost its threatening edge, replaced by something that might have been fear. Elena nodded slowly, her expression grim. "The energy signatures from the Vreth Kai colonies matched the patterns described in those ancient records," she confirmed, "and the way the colonies were destroyed, the way all life was simply erased without apparent weapon damage, that matches too. And humanity believes that the Silence has awakened and begun feeding again." The chamber erupted into chaos once more, with representatives shouting questions and demands and accusations. But Elena stood calm at the center of the storm, waiting for the noise to fade. When it finally did, she spoke the words that would determine whether humanity would face this enemy alone or with all eyes at their side. You can choose to see us as a threat, she said, and you can spend your strength trying to contain us while the silence grows bolder and hungrier. Or you can accept that humanity saw this coming when no one else did, and we built the weapons that might actually hurt these things. And we are offering to stand between your worlds and the darkness. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives from dozens of species. Beings who had looked down on humanity for 6 decades. Beings who now faced a choice that would shape the fate of the galaxy. We did not build the indomitable will to conquer you, she said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. We built it because we knew that someday something terrible would come, and we refused to let our species die without a fight. And now we are offering that same protection to everyone in this chamber. High Chancellor Varmeth studied her for a long moment, and then he asked the question that mattered most. And if we refuse your help? Elena met his gaze without hesitation. Then humanity will hunt this enemy alone, she said, and when we find them and destroy them, and we will destroy them, we will remember who stood with us and who tried to chain us while innocent worlds burned. The choice was made in silence. In the spaces between heartbeats, and the Galactic Senate would never be the same again. Admiral Marcus Chun stood on the command bridge of the Indomitable Will and watched the stars streak past as his ship hurtled toward the Vreth-Kai system of Hollow's Rest. And he felt the weight of every soul aboard, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The crew numbered 8,000. The finest officers and specialists that humanity had produced in 3 generations of secret preparation. And they had trained for this moment their entire lives, had run simulations and studied theoretical models and prepared themselves for a battle that might be impossible to winnow. The theory was about to become reality. The Silence Harvester appeared on sensors as they dropped out of hyperspace, and the bridge went quiet as every officer stared at the image that filled their displays. A moon-sized vessel of black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, covered in geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly, was feeding on the debris of a world that had once held 2 billion Vreth-Kai colonists, drawing streams of energy from the shattered remains of cities and ships and lives. And it moved with a patience that spoke of absolute confidence in its own invincibility. Admiral Chun studied the vessel for 3 heartbeats, analyzing its position and its energy output and its apparent lack of concern at their arrival. And then he gave the order that would change the course of galactic history. All batteries fire at will, he said, and the Indomitable Will became a storm of light and fury. Weapons that had been designed in secret labs and tested only in simulations reached across the void and struck the Harvester with forces that should have been impossible. Energies that tore through shields the elder races had declared impenetrable. Impacts that ripped holes in armor that had survived for 100,000 years. The Harvester shuddered and stopped feeding, turning toward the human vessel with what might have been surprise. And then it returned fire. Admiral Chun had known this moment would come, had prepared himself for the reality that his ship might not survive the first exchange. And yet nothing could have truly readied him for the sight of silence weapons reaching toward his crew. The beings were not energy in any conventional sense, but something older and stranger, something that seemed to drain the light from space itself as they crossed the distance between the vessels. And when they struck the Indomitable Will, the ship screamed. Hundreds died in the first volley, their life energy torn from their bodies by weapons that had been ancient when the Ethel were still learning to make tools. And the ship's armor buckled and twisted under forces that defied physics as the elder races understood them. But the Indomitable Will did not stop. Admiral Chun gripped his command throne as the ship shook around him, watching damage reports flood across his displays, watching the casualty numbers climb with terrible speed. And he gave the only order that mattered: maintain attack speed. he commanded. And his voice carried across the bridge with a calm that he did not feel. All weapons continue firing. And someone get me a damage report on their primary hull. The ship surged forward, closing the distance to the harvester despite the punishment it was taking. And the crew responded to their admiral's confidence with a determination that bordered on madness. They had trained for this, had accepted that they might die for this, and they would not flinch. Now the battle lasted 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. And the indomitable will poured everything it had into the ancient enemy. Weapons firing until they overheated and melted, and were replaced by backup systems that fired until they too failed. The harvester fought back with desperate fury, tearing great wounds in the human vessel, killing crew members by the hundreds, pushing the ship to the very edge of destruction. And then something changed. A crack appeared in the harvester's hull, a breach that spread like lightning across its black surface. And internal explosions began to tear the ancient vessel apart from within. Admiral Chun watched the enemy die and felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction that his people had proven what humanity could do. The harvester broke apart in silence, its geometric patterns going dark one by one, its stolen energy dispersing into the void. And the indomitable will floated among the debris of both vessels, burning in a dozen places. Bleeding atmosphere from wounds that should have been fatal. A third of the crew was dead. Admiral Chun, as the reports came in, and the port engines were slag, and half the weapon systems were destroyed, and the ship was in no condition to fight anything. And then the sensors detected the second harvester emerging from hyperspace behind them. Admiral Chun looked at the image of the fresh enemy and felt exhaustion wash over him like a wave. But he pushed it aside and turned to his surviving crew with eyes that held no surrender. Bring us about, he ordered, and prep whatever weapons we have left. And send a message to command, telling them what we learned today. The second battle was shorter and more desperate than the first. And the indomitable will took wounds that should have killed her 3 times over. But somehow she kept fighting, kept firing, kept refusing to accept the death that logic said was inevitable. When the second harvester finally broke apart, the human ship was barely functional. A skeleton of metal and will holding together through nothing but stubbornness, but she was still there across the galaxy. The elder races watched the battle recordings in stunned silence, seeing for the first time what humanity truly was. And they understood at last why this young species had hidden their strength for so long. The Ethel saw the tactical brilliance and the willingness to accept terrible losses for strategic gain. The Keth saw the cold calculation and the refusal to retreat, even when retreat was the only logical choice. The Vior saw the warrior spirit they had thought lost to the galaxy, the pure stubborn fury that refused to bow even to ancient gods. And all of them saw something else, something that made them reconsider everything they had believed about humanity. They saw a species that had looked at impossible odds and decided that impossible was not the same as defeated, that had watched their people die by the thousands and kept fighting anyway, that had proven through blood and fire that they would rather burn than surrender. Indomitable will limped home to a hero's welcome, and the survivors were celebrated across human space. But Admiral Chun knew that this was only the beginning. The silence was awake, and the war had just begun. The war against the silence lasted 11 years, and it burned across 1,000 star systems, and it cost more lives than any conflict the galaxy had ever known. And through it all, humanity stood at the front and refused to break. 6 more human dreadnoughts joined the indomitable will in the first year, each one larger and more powerful than the last, built in shipyards that no longer needed to hide, crewed by volunteers who knew they might never return home but chose to serve anyway. The elder races watched humanity's commitment and felt something they had not experienced in millennia. Shame. The Ethel were the first to join, sending their elegant warships to fight alongside the brutal human vessels. and their admirals learned new tactics from human officers who treated every battle as if defeat was simply not an option. The Keth followed, their swarm fleets filling the gaps in human formations, their cold calculation finding new purpose in protecting the allies who had shown them what true determination looked like. Even the Vira committed their warriors to the cause, and the ancient reptilian soldiers found something they had thought lost forever: a war worth fighting, a cause greater than glory, a purpose that made their sacrifice meaningful. But it was always the human ships at the vanguard, always human crews who took the missions that everyone else called suicide, always human blood that paid the highest price for victory. Admiral Marcus Chun became a legend across the galaxy, a name spoken with respect by species who had dismissed humanity as irrelevant just years before. And he led his fleet into battle after battle with the same calm determination that had carried him through Hollow's Rest. The Silence fought back with terrible fury, awakening more harvesters from their ancient sleep, sending waves of destruction against worlds that had never known war. And for every victory the Allied forces won, they paid a cost that made the accountants weep. Billions died across the galaxy. An entire species vanished into the darkness. And there were moments when it seemed that nothing could stop the ancient enemy from reclaiming what they had once ruled. But humanity refused to despair. They built more ships and trained more crews and developed new weapons that pushed the boundaries of what science said was possible. And they shared everything with their allies because victory mattered more than secrets. Lena Vasquez served as the diplomatic coordinator for the Alliance, working endless hours to keep the coalition together when old grudges and new fears threatened to tear it apart. And she grew old in the service of a cause she had dedicated her life to long before the first shot was fired. The final battle came at the Silent Citadel, a structure larger than most moons that floated in the void between galaxies, the heart of the ancient enemy's power, the source of their terrible strength. The Allied fleet gathered for the assault. Thousands of ships from dozens of species, the largest military force the galaxy had ever assembled. And at its head flew the indomitable Will, scarred and repaired 100 times, her hull bearing the marks of every battle she had survived. Admiral Chun stood on his bridge and looked at the citadel that filled his view screen. And he knew what he had to do. The assault began with a fury that shook the stars. Weapons fire crossing the void in streams of light that could have burned worlds. And the Silence defended their home with everything they had left. The battle raged for 3 days, and ships died by the hundreds. And the void filled with debris and bodies, and the screams of the dying transmitted across every frequency. The Allied forces pushed forward inch by bloody inch, paying for every kilometer with lives that could never be replaced. And the Silence threw everything they had at the attackers with the desperation of beings who knew that defeat meant extinction on the third day. Admiral Chun made his decision. The Citadel's shields were failing, but not fast enough. And the Allied losses were mounting beyond what any commander could accept. And Chun saw only one way to end this before there was nothing left to save. He ordered his crew to the escape pods, every single one of them, and he watched them go with eyes that held no regret, only a fierce pride in the people who had served with him through hell itself. The last escape pod, launched as the Indomitable, Will accelerated toward the breach in the Citadel's shields. And Admiral Marcus Chun sat alone on his bridge and thought of everyone he had lost, and everyone he was saving, and everyone who would live because of what happened. Next, the Dreadnought struck the Citadel at maximum velocity, driving deep into its ancient structure. And then Chun activated the reactor overload that his engineers had installed years ago for exactly this moment. The explosion was visible from star systems away, a new sun burning in the darkness between galaxies, and when it faded, the Citadel was gone. And the silence was broken forever. The Galactic Senate reconvened 1 year after the victory. In a chamber, that had been rebuilt to honor those who had fallen. And Ambassador Elena Vasquez rose to address the assembly with hair gone gray and eyes that had seen too much death. Her seat was no longer in the outer ring where newcomers sat, but at the very center of the chamber, among the founding races, in a position that humanity had earned through sacrifice beyond measure. "You feared us," she said, and her voice carried across the silent chamber with a weight that made every representative lean forward to listen. "When our first Dreadnought appeared, you saw only a threat, and you did not understand." She paused and looked across the thousands of faces watching her. Beings from hundreds of worlds who had fought and bled and died alongside humanity. "We did not build those ships because we wanted to conquer you," she continued, "and we did not hide our strength because we planned to betray you. We built them because we knew that the universe is dark and full of teeth. And we learned that lesson on our own world, in our own wars." In the long climb from caves to stars, her voice grew stronger, carrying the conviction of a species that had faced extinction and refused to accept it. "We knew that peace is not given," she said. "It is earned and held and fought for. And we prepared for the worst because hope without preparation is just another way to die." She straightened and looked directly at the High Council, at the leaders of species who had once dismissed humanity as irrelevant. "We are humanity," she declared, "and we do not kneel and we do not break. And as long as a single human heart still beats, we will hold the line against whatever darkness comes." The chamber did not applaud, because applause seemed too small for what they had witnessed, for the 11 years of war and the millions of dead and the sacrifice that had saved them all. Instead, one by one, the representatives of 1,000 worlds rose to their feet, a gesture of respect older than any of their civilizations, a recognition that the galaxy had changed forever. The Ethel bowed their graceful heads, and the Keth clicked their mandibles in patterns that translated as honor beyond words, and the Vior placed their fists over their hearts in salute, and Elena Vasquez stood among them, the ambassador of a species that had hidden in the shadows for 60 years and then emerged to save everyone. And she allowed herself to weep for the first time since the war began for Admiral Chun, who had given everything for the crews of 7 dreadnoughts, who had followed him into the dark for the billions who had died, so that billions more could live. The galaxy had found its guardians, protectors who asked for nothing except the chance to stand between innocent worlds and the things that would destroy them, and humanity had finally come home.